Marbbeth stood barefoot on the edge of the animal hide rug, the thin white fabric of her shift clinging to her legs from the afternoon rain. The Apache lodge was quiet, too quiet, as if the world had been holding its breath. The small fire at the back flickered, casting restless shadows on the woven walls and illuminating every bone along her arms. She wasn't beautiful. No one had ever said she was. Her eyes were too large, her chin too sharp, her body too thin from too many winters lived in silence and neglect. She had been traded, and she knew it. Everyone did. In exchange for a piece of grazing land and 2 crates of rusted rifles, she was sent here, to become the wife of a man she had never met. There was no wedding, no feast, no vows or flowers, just a simple ceremony, hands bound together with leather, then unbound again as if the bond was nothing but formality. No one asked her opinion. No one cared what she felt. She had nodded like she always had, with the obedience of someone taught from childhood that survival meant being small, being quiet, being acceptable. Naoka, the man she'd been given to, sat by the fire, his wide shoulders haloed in flame. He was younger than she'd expected, strong and still as stone. His long black hair was tied back, and his face was unreadable, carved in silence. He hadn't spoken a word since she entered the lodge. He hadn't looked at her. Marbbeth's fingers clenched the sides of her shift. Her feet ached, and her back screamed from the tension, but she didn't sit. She was used to being ignored, to being dismissed, to being a burden too plain to notice and too quiet to matter. Her father's silence had been a weapon. The women in town had taught her to disappear. She had learned her place. So she waited for the disdain, for the rejection, for the cold shoulder she'd known all her life. But Naoka didn't reject her. He didn't speak either. Instead, he rose, slowly, without threat, and walked toward her with a clay basin in his hands, steam curling from it. He set it gently on the ground in front of her and knelt. She froze. Naoka didn't touch her face, didn't lift her chin. He simply reached down, unwrapped the cloth around her ankles, and began to wash her feet in warm sage water. One foot, then the other. His touch was gentle, steady, and almost reverent. He didn't flinch at the scars or the redness, didn't rush the act or make a show of it. He just moved with the calm care of someone tending to something sacred. Marbbeth didn't know how to react. No one had ever touched her this way. Not like this. Not like she mattered. She bit her lip. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. But something inside her cracked, not from pain, but from a flicker of something she had forgotten how to feel. Hope. When he was finished, he pressed his forehead briefly to the tops of her feet, just once, before rising and returning to his place by the fire. He didn't say a word. She didn't sleep that night. But for the first time in her life, she realized that silence didn't always mean cruelty. Sometimes it meant space. And space, for a woman who had never been allowed to breathe freely, felt like the closest thing to mercy. She didn't know his story. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time, she didn't feel invisible. Marbbeth had spent her life learning how to disappear. She'd learned it as a girl, hiding behind her mother's skirts when her father's voice rose. She'd learned it in the fields, in the kitchens, in the cramped corners of every room where women weren't allowed to speak too loudly or take up too much space. She'd learned that being seen meant being punished, being noticed meant being judged, so she made herself small, invisible, bearable. But now, here, in this quiet tent lit by a flickering fire, something inside her shifted. Naoka had not touched her out of lust or pity. He hadn't spoken a single word, but he had knelt and washed her feet. It was such a small act, and yet it cracked something deep in her chest. Not from pain, but from the possibility that she might be worth gentleness. She sat for a long time after, curled near the fire, the scent of sage clinging to her skin like a blessing she hadn't asked for. Naoka lay silently on his mat across the tent, not sleeping, but not watching either. His silence didn't feel cold or distant. It felt like space. Space she didn't know she needed. The memory of his hands, steady, warm, reverent, lingered with each breath she took. It wasn't just what he had done. It was how he had done it. Without demand, without expectation, without disgust. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. Because cruelty was predictable. But kindness made her wonder if she'd been wrong about herself all along. The next morning, she woke before the sun, expecting orders or instructions, something to prove her worth, but there were none. When she stepped outside the tent, the air was crisp, and Naoka was already up. He stood beside a small girl, no older than 6, whose wild curls peeked out from behind a stack of water barrels. She looked like she was made of earth and wind, barefoot, dust-covered, cautious. As soon as she saw Marbbeth, the child bolted. But Naoka lifted one hand and the girl stopped, hesitating like a deer on the edge of the trees. Without turning, Naoka spoke. His voice was quiet, grounded. Her name is Waya. She's not mine by blood, but she's mine. Marbbeth froze. It was the first time she'd heard his voice. It was lower than she expected, steady, unhurried. A voice that didn't demand attention, but held it. He added simply, "Her mother died 2 winters ago. No one claimed her. So I did." Waya peeked out again, this time holding something in her small hands. A bundle of twigs and feathers. She stepped forward, barely, then stopped and held it out. Marbbeth moved just 1 step and the girl vanished behind the barrels. But the bundle remained. Marbbeth bent down and picked it up. It was a doll. Crude, fragile, made with care. And the face drawn in ash looked unmistakably like hers. She didn't know what to say. Her hands trembled. Behind her, Naoka said only one thing. "You don't need to win her. Just don't lie to her." Marbbeth turned to look at him, but he had already walked away, grinding herbs in a bowl as if nothing remarkable had happened. But to her it had, because no one had ever spoken to her like that before. Not as a burden, not as a problem, but as someone who could be trusted. She stared down at the doll and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not safety. Not love. But the first, trembling breath of hope. That evening, Marbbeth sat outside the tent with a needle and some borrowed thread, mending the edge of a worn shawl. The air smelled of smoke, wild herbs, and something softer she couldn't name. Waya hovered nearby again, not close enough to speak, but not far enough to disappear. The little girl sat on a rock, braiding blades of grass and sneaking glances with every breath. Marbbeth didn't speak. She didn't know what she was allowed to say. So she let her hands speak instead. She finished the mending by sunset, smoothing the newly stitched fabric with a quiet sense of satisfaction. When she looked up, Waya was gone. But something sat where the girl had been. Another doll. This one was smaller, still made of twigs, but this time it had a strip of cloth from Marbbeth's discarded hem tied around its waist. Her breath caught. She pressed the doll to her chest, unsure what it meant, but certain it mattered. Later, inside the tent, Naoka placed a small plate of cooked rabbit beside her mat. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just tapped his fingers twice on the ground before returning to his place by the fire. She didn't need him to explain. The gesture said, "Eat. You are here now." It was the most welcome she had ever received. She ate slowly, trying not to weep. That night, she curled on her mat with the twig doll tucked beneath her arm. And for the first time in her life, silence felt like safety. In the days that followed, Marbbeth began to move differently. She swept the tent floor before the sun rose, folded the furs neatly, stirred the embers of the fire so they would catch easily again. No one asked her to. No one scolded her or praised her. But she did it anyway, because it made her feel real. She no longer waited to be told. One morning, as she rinsed her face in a bowl of cool water just outside the tent, Naoka stepped behind her. She froze, old instincts tightening her spine. But his touch never came with force. Instead, he gently lifted her damp hair and pulled it away from her face, tying it back with a thin strip of leather. His fingers were deliberate, careful, not claiming, not controlling, honoring. He said nothing, just stepped back and let her finish washing. As he walked away, he said quietly, "So you can see clearly." Marbbeth stood still long after he was gone, heart pounding. No man had ever touched her without turning it into ownership. But this had felt like a gift. That afternoon, as she sat with 2 elder women grinding corn beneath the sun, one of them leaned in, grinning with nearly toothless delight. "His mother wore her hair like that," the woman said, "the day she fell in love." Marbbeth didn't reply. Her face flushed, but she kept her head down, the rhythm of her hands moving faster than her breath. Still, she smiled, just a little, because something inside her had shifted. Not all at once. Not loudly, but enough. She had crossed a threshold, from a world where she was invisible into a world where she might just be seen. And not as a burden, not as a transaction, but as herself. Marbbeth learned to live slowly. The village did not demand her transformation. No one handed her a new name or forced her into rituals she didn't understand. Instead, they left space. And in that space, she began to learn. She learned how to mend torn shawls with sinew and patience. She stirred cooking pots over smoky fires, her hands absorbing old recipes through gesture and scent. She fetched water with the other women, letting their conversations drift over her like a language she didn't yet speak but felt welcome to. And always, Waya hovered nearby. At first, the girl said nothing, just watched. But one afternoon, as Marbbeth sat weaving fibers into a small mat, Waya knelt beside her and handed her a feather. No explanation. No conditions, just trust, quiet, and pure. Naoka remained steady in the background, never loud, never pushing. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, he would sit beside her and braid her hair. It started one day when the wind tangled it so badly she couldn't comb through the knots. She had winced in frustration, trying not to cry. He had taken the brush from her hand without a word and started untangling each knot with slow, deliberate care. His fingers were warm and unhurried, moving with the kind of reverence she had only ever seen in ritual. "Your hair is not something to punish," he said once. "It's something that remembers the wind." She didn't know what that meant, but she believed him. One night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Marbbeth sat alone, washing with cold water from the basin. She thought Naoka was gone, out hunting or checking on the horses. She pulled the fabric of her dress down to scrub the back of her shoulders. The movement exposed her scars, long pale ridges across her back. She had never let anyone see them. Not willingly. They were the result of refusing to marry the butcher's son, a punishment delivered by her own father, who told her stubbornness made her worthless. A gust of wind pulled open the tent flap. Naoka stepped in. He froze. She expected him to turn away or ask what had happened, but he did neither. He set down the pouch in his hand, pulled a small clay jar from it, and came to kneel behind her. She didn't speak, didn't breathe. He dipped 2 fingers into the jar and began gently applying the cool salve to her back, starting with the lowest scar. His hands didn't tremble. They didn't press too hard, they didn't avoid, they honored. When he reached the highest scar, near her neck, he paused. "This one," he whispered, "is yours to keep, so you remember you survived." Tears stung her eyes. He didn't look at her like she was damaged. He looked at her like she had done something impossible and sacred, like she had lived. Then he left the tent without another word. That night, Waya curled up beside her, a small hand resting on her wrist. Marbbeth didn't flinch, didn't pull away. For the first time in years, someone touched her and she didn't want to disappear. She simply breathed, slowly and fully, and let herself be held by the silence. It happened on a morning soaked in sunlight and birdsong. Marbbeth had just finished helping one of the elder women knead dough near the communal stones. Her hands were dusted in flour, warm from the fire and the work. She had smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in weeks, though the gesture still felt unfamiliar on her face. Then the question rose in her throat like smoke. "May I ask," she said softly to the elder beside her, "what do they call me?" The old woman's eyes, clouded by age but sharp with wisdom, paused in their work. She turned to Marbbeth and placed a flour-smudged hand gently over her chest. "You've never said your own name, not once." "That is a heavy silence for any heart." Marbbeth swallowed. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. "I was called names growing up," she said, her throat tightening. "But never, never with love, not since my mother died." The elder didn't scold her, didn't comfort her with platitudes. She only nodded once, slowly, as if confirming a truth already known. "Then it is time you name yourself. Not be named by the world." The words pierced her deeper than any insult ever had. She sat in stillness long after the elder returned to the dough. Around her, the village moved as usual. Children laughing, smoke curling from the cooking fires, water splashing from wooden pails. But inside her, something cracked open. She whispered it, at first, to no one in particular. "Marbbeth." It felt strange on her tongue, familiar yet newly born. She whispered it again. "Marbbeth." And the third time, she said it aloud. Full, steady. "My name is Marbbeth." That afternoon the children began calling her Mara, not because they were told to, but because they chose to. The name fit her like a well-worn shawl, soft, quiet, wrapped in gentleness. And for once, she didn't feel the need to correct them. Later that day, Naoka led her into the woods beyond the creek. He didn't say where they were going. He didn't need to. They walked in silence, the wind rustling the tamarack trees above them, the forest alive with bird calls and the hum of insects. When they reached the water, he knelt and picked up a smooth, oval-shaped stone. Deep red ran through its center like a vein. "Bloodstone," he said. "We carry them to remember those who walked before us." He handed it to her. "Choose one." She traced its lines with her thumb, the cool surface grounding her. She didn't ask who he meant. She already understood. She placed her hand beside his in the stream. And then, without hesitation, she said it again. "My name is Marbbeth." Naoka didn't speak right away. He simply looked at her, really looked, and then closed his eyes for a moment, as if storing the name somewhere sacred. "It suits you better than silence," he said. In that moment, the name no longer belonged to shame or silence. It belonged to her. That evening, she carved a small figure out of driftwood beside the children. When one of the boys asked what it was, she replied without thinking, "That's me. And this one is you." The boy laughed, delighted. The others gathered around, asking for their own. And as she shaped the stories into wood with her hands, she realized that what she'd longed for wasn't to be seen as beautiful, only to be seen as real. And now, she was. Marbbeth stood at the edge of the river, the hem of her dress brushing against the reeds, her bare feet buried in the cool mud. The late afternoon sun dappled through the leaves above, painting the water in moving gold. But inside her, there was no warmth. The children had accepted her. The women had braided her hair, painted her cheeks with ochre, and placed beads in her hands. They had offered her silence and space and presence. Naoka had never once tried to change her, only to see her. And yet, the fear still clung to her like shadow. "What if this is only kindness?" she whispered to the river, voice shaking. "What if none of this is real? What if they'll never truly let me stay?" The words felt traitorous even as they escaped her mouth. But they were real, and she was tired of swallowing truth for the sake of surviving. Behind her, footsteps rustled. She didn't turn, but she knew it was him. Naoka stood beside her, saying nothing. For a long while, only the river spoke. Then slowly, he reached into the leather pouch at his waist and pulled out something small, wrapped in hide. He placed it in her hands. Marbbeth opened it gently. Inside lay a single eagle feather, dark-tipped and bound with sinew and a turquoise bead. She looked up, confused. Naoka's voice was low. "It belonged to my sister," he said. "She died the winter I turned 17. His gaze stayed on the water, as if he were watching something that lived only in memory. She used to say, 'We don't belong where we're told. We belong where we're held.'" Marbbeth's throat tightened. No one had ever given her anything that wasn't transactional. No one had ever placed something sacred into her hands without expecting it to weigh her down. But this wasn't a chain. It wasn't a gift meant to earn gratitude. It was trust. She clutched the feather to her chest, her voice nearly breaking. "Why give it to me?" Naoka turned to her at last. "Because you still think you're waiting to be allowed in. But you've already been chosen, you just don't believe it yet." Her breath caught. Her knees buckled slightly and she lowered herself to the river's edge, the feather resting in her lap. The current flowed by like a hymn. She didn't speak again, not for a long time. Instead, she let herself sit in that silence, in the weight of what had just been offered, not just the feather, but a place to belong. That night, around the fire, the children brought her small gifts, another twig doll, a bundle of lavender, a strip of dyed cloth. The women asked her to tell a story, and she did, her voice soft and unsure but growing stronger with each word. When one of the youngest girls leaned into her side and whispered, "You feel like home," Marbbeth didn't cry. She simply smiled and whispered back, "So do you." Because this was the price of healing, not pain, not shame, but the terrifying risk of believing you're worthy of love. And for the first time, Marbbeth dared to pay it. The rain came quietly, like a whisper brushing across the rooftops of the village. Most had already gone to sleep, their fires reduced to glowing embers, their voices tucked beneath blankets. But Marbbeth stood outside the lodge, just under the edge of the overhang, her arms wrapped loosely around herself. Face tilted toward the sky, she no longer flinched at thunder, The ceremonial dress clung to her skin, still warm from the fire earlier, her hair, damp and unbound, draped across her shoulders. Around her, the world exhaled, soft, earthy, alive. She didn't notice Naoka until his voice broke through the sound of rain. "You're not hiding?" He wasn't asking. It was a statement, spoken as gently as a promise. Marbbeth turned to look at him. His braids were soaked, his tunic streaked with rain, but his face, calm, open, carried no judgment, only presence. "I don't want to hide," she answered, and she meant it. Not because she had something to prove, but because for the first time she wasn't afraid of being seen. The rain fell harder, drops dancing around them like sacred rhythm. Naoka stepped forward, not to shield her, not to offer warmth, but simply to join her. He knelt in the mud before her, just as he had on their first night, but this time there was no tension in her body, no fear in her breath. He didn't speak. He just reached out and took her bare foot in his hand, and once again, with a tenderness so profound it hurt, he washed her feet, this time with nothing but rainwater. Marbbeth gasped, not from cold, but from the rush of emotion swelling in her chest. She thought she had understood what the act meant the first time. But this time, she knew. This was not pity. This was not habit. This was not forgiveness. This was covenant. Not between man and wife in the way the world defined it, but between two souls who had seen the inside of each other's silence and stayed. He looked up at her then, his dark eyes catching the reflection of the storm. "I never thought anyone would see me," she whispered. Naoka smiled, not broadly, not with flourish, but with that same steady softness she had come to trust. "We see with more than eyes." Marbbeth's hand rose slowly and rested over his heart. "Then show me what you see here." He pressed his palm over hers. A woman who was always more than the mirror she feared. They stood like that, in the rain, as the thunder rolled low like a drumbeat beneath the earth. The village slept on, unaware of the quiet miracle unfolding just beyond its firelight. But something ancient stirred between them, something not loud or fleeting, but enduring. The kind of bond not born from longing, but from return. Not a return to what was, but to what could now finally be. When they stepped back into the shelter, she didn't follow behind him. He didn't walk ahead. They walked side by side, as equals, as something whole. And for the first time in her life, Marbbeth didn't wonder if she was lovable. She knew she was already loved. The fire crackled in the center of the gathering, casting warm shadows on the circle of women and children who sat together in the lodge. The air smelled of crushed sage, roasted corn, and lavender smoke. Above them, the stars spilled across the sky like silver seeds. Marbbeth sat cross-legged on a woven mat, a ceremonial dress of deerskin wrapped around her body, its beadwork catching the firelight like tiny constellations. Her hands were stained with red berry juice from painting with the children earlier, and her lap cradled a carved wooden figure, a story doll she had shaped that morning. The children sat around her, wide-eyed, listening to her voice. "And when the wind told the mountain its name," she said, her voice steady and low, the mountain didn't laugh. It listened. A ripple of soft laughter moved through the group. One little girl crawled into her lap, arms curled around Marbbeth's waist like she'd always belonged there. And maybe she had. Because Marbbeth was no longer the woman who walked into the tent that first night, small and trembling and certain she had nothing worth offering. Now, she was called Mara by the children, a name that rolled off their tongues like warmth. The women offered her space without asking. The elders greeted her with quiet nods of recognition. She didn't have to prove anything anymore. She was simply theirs. Later, as the fire burned low, Naoka sat beside her in the quiet. He didn't speak right away. He never rushed. Then, softly he asked, "Would you build a home with me?" No ceremony, no grand gesture. Just the question, offered like an open hand. Marbbeth didn't hesitate. She didn't look away. Her answer was clear, steady, and rooted. Yes, together. Because this wasn't a fairy tale. There had been no rescue, no vows under the moon, no sudden kiss to heal old scars. What they had built was slower, quieter, truer. Their love had been forged not through declarations, but through the patience of presence, in every silent gesture, in every shared meal, in every time he had waited without demanding. She had never needed a man to carry her. She had only ever needed someone who would walk beside her. The next morning, they stood at the edge of the clearing, where wood beams and stacked stones marked the start of something new, their new lodge, their shared beginning. It wasn't finished, it wasn't perfect, but neither were they, and that was exactly what made it sacred. As the village stirred to life, one of the girls ran up to her with a blanket and said, without ceremony, "Welcome home." Marbbeth didn't cry. She only pulled the girl into her arms and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." That night, beneath the same stars that had once watched her hide in silence, she and Naoka sat by the new hearth, not speaking. They didn't need to. He reached for her hand. She let him hold it, not like a possession, but like a promise lived, not spoken. And together, they watched the fire grow, not as strangers, not as survivors, but as builders of something lasting, something healed, something whole.